Here we go.
There we go. It's Friday, June 11th, and we are 1 week away from the French Grand Prix. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a ton of stuff to talk about. Welcome to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. Joining you tonight, as always, is Mr. Mark Hamilton and Mr. Mark Daly, repping the great city of Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. We got a whole bunch of stuff we're going to talk about today. Not the least of which is Red Bull, the rise of the glory and unstoppable super team. We're going to talk a little bit about the inevitable, complete, and total collapse of Mercedes and Valtteri Bottas. That is inevitable. We are going to talk about the rise of the lovable character Yuki Tsunoda, and we're going to take your Twitter questions. But before we get into those meaty subjects, my friend, I got a couple of beefs I have to pick with you.
Oh,
First,
really?
we have
First,
known each
wow.
other for about a year and a half.
Yeah,
Uh,
about that. Yeah.
we do a lot of work together on social media. And the
hmm
other day, I log into my personal Twitter account and I see I've got a new follower. I'm like, oh, that's
hmm
fantastic. It's you. How does it take you a year and a half to follow me? And number two, I'll let you. So please respond. Please respond.
I have no defense. The only thing I'm worse at than being an actual real life friend is a friend on social media. So I'm just I'm that guy.
That's funny. I have to share too. My boss, who's been my boss on and off for probably 11 or 12 years now, I originally tried to add him on Facebook in 2009, and he still, and I think at this point it's probably almost a running joke, he still hasn't added me. So 12, 13 years later, not that I'm a big Facebook guy, but yeah, it hurts a little bit. And then the other thing too is last Sunday we did our recap of Baku, the Azerbaijan Grand Prix.
Yep.
Fantastic race. I was so excited. Your preamble, by the way, was excellent. But at 37 minutes, I think you covered all of the topics, and we probably could have gone right into the close. So today, you've allowed me to do the intro, and I'm going to take this as far as I can. But in all
That's awesome.
seriousness,
I'm gonna put my chair back. I'm gonna just chill out, and every once in a while, I'm just going to interject with a couple of All right, sounds good.
humorous comments.
Yeah,
Yep. Sounds good. Yep.
exactly.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
And this is BC, so I'm sure you've got some craft beers in a small bar fridge in your recording studio. But in all seriousness, shout out to our listeners for a couple of reasons. Obviously, our social media engagement has been exceptional the last couple of weeks, the last
Yeah.
month, the last 2 months. Obviously, we're excited to hear, excited to talk to everybody. We tried a couple of things via Twitter this week. We tried Twitter Spaces yesterday, and shout out to everybody that was able to join us. We were really just testing the capability and to get a sense of whether that's something we wanted to do in the future again. And honestly, like the turnout was fantastic. So shout out to Barry, Joe, Charlie, Andre, Wallace, Williams, RJ, Reiko, Leo, and everyone whose name I forgot to record. But we had a really great 3 hour session. And I think the other thing we've been doing as well, and we're going to be doing another one this coming Monday, is a show that's geared a little bit more towards answering your questions. But before I pass it over to you, my friend, because I know you've got some really exciting updates as well, I do want to apologize to everybody. I think a lot of people are really excited. We're excited, and we're getting a lot of questions. And I think 2 weeks ago, I had about 200. And I'll be honest, I'm not the most organized person in the world, so I'm struggling to categorize them and keep track of them. So if we ever miss a question, don't think it's because we don't have love for you and your question. Just follow up with us. Be that squeaky wheel, because ultimately that will get the proverbial grease eventually. But my friend, I know you've got an exciting update for everybody as well.
Well, first, before I get to the exciting update, I mean, if you're going to put me on blast, I'm going to have to reciprocate and put you on blast. Okay, yes, after all this time, I actually did give you a follow on social media. I don't know if I got a follow back, but hey, I'm not going to, I did actually go and check, but I'm just going to put it out there. So maybe it's a half hearted blast. But, anyways, before we get into the show, I want to give a shout out to our friends Jeff and Jeff Andy, the hosts of the Evolving Dads podcast. They had us on as their very first inaugural guests a couple of weeks ago. And that dropped. It was good fun. We talked Formula One. We talked about what it's like to be dads, obviously. So go check them out. Their website is evolvingdads.com. You can also find them on Facebook at facebook.com/evolving.dads. They're also on Instagram at evolving.dads and also on Twitter at evolvingdads. So this just launched, and I think they've already got about 3 or 4 episodes teed up that are going to drop. If not already, they're going to drop at any time. So it was really exciting and it was fun to get involved and help them launch this cool new project of theirs.
Cool.
All right. Well, Mark, where do we want to start? Like you said, we've got emails, we've got tweets, we've got lots and lots and lots and lots of news to get into this week. So why don't let's start with the news? I mean, this
Sure.
is what we should usually be talking about, and I should find my notes here. But the one thing that I've really sort of sat back after the last, the race last weekend, and it really it was awesome. I really enjoyed it at the time, and that hasn't diminished at all. But I thought was really interesting is that the drivers were 100% behind the race director's decision to resume the race after the red flag, just a couple of laps from the end there after Max had his big tire blowout and everything like that, and it was exciting. And we talked about it at the time that if this is what we could look forward to just in a very spontaneous two-lap shootout and real sprint to the end, that it's going to be pretty exciting, or at least we hope it will, that it bodes well for the sprint races. But I'm excited to hear that the drivers themselves were very much in favor of this, because I feel that their initial reaction to the whole confirmation, if you will, about introducing the limited run of sprint races this year was a bit lukewarm. What do you think?
This is a topic I'm really excited about, and it's something that I hear from our listeners consistently about in terms of our thoughts. How can it be modeled? How can it be improved? But I totally agree with that thought that you shared on Sunday about the fact that perhaps the most exciting part of that race was the restart, the grid restart, and it was a super short shootout, right? It's like anything goes, anything can happen because you don't have 50 or 60 laps where the field's going to spread out. So it was super unpredictable, and I thought that was exciting. And I think as well that your assertion that, hey, that experience, that feeling, that emotion could translate into sprint qualifying is totally, totally valid. And if anything, it just got me more excited for sprint qualifying. And I think the first event we're going to see that will be in Silverstone, which is coming up super, super quickly. I think the other thing, and this came up with a number of our listeners as well, and kind of when I was perusing Reddit and some of the other kind of Formula One themed sites, is this idea that, and I don't think this is going to change because I think the TV networks would just die because it would cut into their TV revenue. But I wonder sometimes too whether the F1 Grand Prix itself is too long. It's a pretty big commitment, an hour 30,
Mhm.
an hour 40, especially if the outcome's predetermined. And of course, in Baku, it wasn't predetermined and it was super unpredictable and there was lots going on. So people stayed super engaged. But I think what's going to make sprint qualifying so exciting is it's kind of a smaller bite-sized chunk. You can sit down and consume it in one go. And I think the other thing that's going to be interesting is a Formula One race today will always have, by the sporting regulations, a tire change. So you've got to wear two different compounds over the course of the race, which means there's always going to be a little bit of strategy involved in doing that pit stop. In qualifying, it's going to be a little bit different. And that component of the strategy is going to be gone, which to me is just fine because I'd rather, and I'm not totally clear on what the tire regulations are for sprint qualifying. I would rather see these cars go out on the softest possible tires and just go all out. I don't want to see cars nursing tires for 30 laps to conserve compound and grip for the final sprint at the end. Like I would rather just see these cars go all out and attack in every single corner. So I'm
Mhm.
super pumped. And I don't know if that answers your question, but the one other thing I'll quickly add too is we had a lot of questions about who and why are certain types of restarts kind of determined, like who determines that, why is it determined, and ultimately we leaned into Tim Haraney for this one because I actually went to the technical regulations and I went to the sporting regulations because it's like, what is the deciding factor, what drives this? And his perspective was really ultimately it just comes down to the stewards. They'll ultimately make that decision based on circumstances, based on track condition, based on timing and all those kind of pieces. So that was very much a conscious effort to do the grid restart at the end. And I was totally all for it.
Yeah, it is interesting too, because we have to remember that there is a 2-hour time limit to run these
Right.
races, and you don't often see them come up against it. Sometimes you do when the weather's really bad, and the lap times are obviously slower, and there are red flags and things like that, and they do have to stop the race. It is not unusual it's not very common, but it does. It's one of these things that occasionally pops up every couple of years. I mean, like you say, I mean, the weather was good, the time was fine, they were within the 2 hours, and race director Michael Massey said, basically, he said there was no reason why they should not restart that race for the last couple of laps. And I think too that it was probably pushing about 5:30, quarter to six local time in Baku City, because I think a race start was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon there, and it was good. I mean, in those conditions, if there isn't an obvious safety concern for weather or something on the track, or like what we saw in Bahrain last year when Grosjean had his big accident and they had to rebuild. The Armco barriers and stuff like that. That wasn't the case in this race. I mean, it was the fact that we saw a couple of very bizarre tire meltdowns, basically the way that those tires on both Lance Stroll and Max Verstappen's car just really came apart. I mean, the safety issues with the tires themselves, and that they weren't really living up to, or the expected tire life. And yeah, I think that they made the right call. It was exciting, and this isn't the first time, because they did it last year in Monza as well, because we saw a couple of red flags, most noticeably when Charles had his big shunt in Parabolica when he went into the tire barrier there, big heavy crash, and they stopped it, and then had all the mayhem. And at one point, because there was two red flags in that one, wasn't there? And then I think Lewis got he got penalized for entering the pit lane, which was that was a bit of a tough one, because he kind of went in at the wrong time, and when they just as they were closing the grid lane, or the pit lane, he was already committed. But this was different than Monza, because the amount of laps left to run was a lot shorter, and it was exciting. And just like we saw it last year in Monza, that it did kind of shake things up. And I guess ultimately, if you're a guy like Nikita Mazepin, that the having a restart 2 laps from the end, you still have finished down towards the bottom of the race order, but at least you didn't finish 4 laps behind.
Right.
So I
Totally.
guess that there are positives to be drawn.
I got a text from my wife as well, just regarding sprint qualifying, because I wanted to
Yep.
clarify this. So this is interesting. So for sprint qualifying, of course, in the actual Grand Prix, teams have to rotate through two different compounds. But in sprint qualifying, each driver has a free choice of tires. At the end of the sprint qualifying, they will return the set with the most completed laps. Unlike the Grand Prix on Sunday, there is no obligatory pit stop during sprint qualifying. So conditions allowing, I think teams would probably just go out on the softest possible compound on that
Mhm.
weekend and just go all for it. But it's interesting that you just touched on Nikita Mazepin too, because one of the things that I think you and I failed to touch on Sunday, and honestly, I think we can be forgiven for this because there were so many other pieces happening, was the
Yeah.
incident that happened between Nikita Mazepin and teammate Mick Schumacher towards the very, very end of that final lap.
Yeah, and it is interesting too. I mean, what was happening is that Mick was trying to make an overtake on Nikita coming down the very long start finish straightaway there. And I'll be completely honest, I completely missed out on it
Me
when it
too.
happened, and in the immediate aftermath I did see something. And when I was just reading up on all the news and all the takeaways from the race itself, and it was really quite interesting, because the headlines that I saw regarding the incident immediately after the race was, it was almost that that Haas was downplaying. It was like, oh yeah, it was no big deal. We've dealt with it, and it's a bit of a non-issue. But I wish I had a link to it, because I saw something on YouTube earlier this week, where somebody had taken and basically synced both in-car cameras from Nikita and from Mick, and it really is quite apparent. I mean, when you see it side by side, it wasn't just like a little flick of the steering wheel to avoid something like a manhole or a water valve or something like that. It was a real sharp
Yeah.
turn. You saw his left hand really go over. I mean, drivers are allowed to make that one defensive maneuver to try and protect the position, but at that point on the straightaway, with the amount of speed that Mick was passing, and he was already alongside Nikita Mazepin, that there was no defense, no pun intended,
Yeah.
for what he did. And I was really quite shocked. And then of course, you hear like Mick on the radio effing and blinding, and obviously very, very upset at what happened. And I was thinking afterwards, I was like, why did this not get more play? Was it just so many other people in the media, much like ourselves, just so busy focused elsewhere on what had happened on Sunday afternoon, that this, I think, was pretty egregious.
I completely agree. It was shocking, and I think from Mick's perspective, he should and is forgiven for his reaction, right? Like, I'll be honest, if I'm driving down the street and somebody switches into my lane, even if they're a half kilometer ahead without signaling, I am going to curse up a storm. If I am doing 300 plus kilometers an hour and
Yeah.
somebody in front of me makes a dangerous maneuver into my lane, that's life threatening. And I think one of the things that we're all very aware of is that Mazepan has upset a lot of the F1 drivers this year. It's almost a running joke. He got Latifi swearing, he got Lance swearing, he got Kimmy swearing, he's got Mick swearing. Like, he's upset a lot of drivers. And part of this could just be that he's a young driver, but I think a lot of it just is a direct reflection of the way he conducted himself on the track in Formula 2 and some of the earlier Formula. And I think the one thing that we're very lucky hasn't transpired yet is actual contact with another car, because in
Mhm.
this case, if he made contact with Mick, there's every reason to believe that one of, or maybe both of those core cars would have been launched airborne, and there could be very serious damage or possibly injury. And I think the sport, I think Haas, and I think the ownership of that team have been very, very lucky that Mazepan's been relatively unscathed so far. And we were talking about this in the live chat yesterday on Twitter Spaces, but ultimately that's just a byproduct or a knock-on effect of the fact that he's driving the worst car on the track. And because he's so far behind everyone else, and because he's effectively getting blue flagged by the race leaders, he's never in a position where he's outright racing another car. And that was one of the few exceptions this year when there has been a competitive battle between him and somebody else. And he demonstrated that he's not mature enough as a driver yet to handle that situation effectively. And we're super lucky that nobody was hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this section of track, I think, is starting to maybe develop a bit of a reputation now. I mean, we saw Lance and Max obviously have big moments there on Sunday. Then there was that incident with Nikita and Mick Schumacher. Then, of course, Lewis switching having his magic button issues. And we've seen a lot of guys go off in that corner over the years. And not to mention Max Verstappen and Danny Ricciardo having that big come together at 2018 when Danny
Yeah.
Ricciardo went up the the Max's gearbox in turn one there. Anyways, let's take a quick break here, Mark. When we come back, there's still a couple of stories left in the aftermath of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. I want to talk about that in just a moment, so don't go away. We will be right back. All right. Well, welcome back to the show, everyone. And well, Baku, that is one of those tracks that you do usually see a safety car. And just to sort of follow up and pick up where we left off just before the break there, we did see that obviously a couple of times this past weekend, and have we had a safety car there every year since 2016 or 2017? It sure feels like it. Anyways, some of the drivers, including Charles Leclerc, Sebastian Vettel, and Carlos Sainz, have all spoken up after the race there, and they said they were quite concerned that there was a bit too long of a delay in actually deploying the safety car after Max had that tire puncture and crashed into the wall. And yeah, well, I mean, obviously, safety has to be paramount. And I'm not really too sure why it would have taken the race director and the stewards so long to really get the car out and deployed. I mean, you have cars there, obviously, a lot of debris on the track at that point, all the carbon fiber bits that came off of Max's car after he crashed into the wall. And I think that's basically what these three drivers, for example, were talking about, is just this delay in getting the safety car out there, because obviously they couldn't just push Max's car out of the way. There was far too much debris out on the track. It seemed like a bit of a no-brainer, but I guess it's always a little bit easier when you're sitting at home and watching on TV.
I agree. I think the difference in this case is it's not like Max was a back marker and he was at the back of the pack in a distant corner away from the grandstand of the production studios. He was leading the race. He was on camera when it happened in real time, live to an international TV audience. Like, this wasn't a surprise. And I think everybody knew it happened. I think what's really disappointing, to your point, is simply how long it took not only to deploy a safety but to get the flags out and to caution the other drivers that there was an incident ahead, right? Like, you have a car approaching Max 20 seconds later that has no understanding that there is a massive massive wreck on the track in front of him. And I think obviously Max was put in a very, very vulnerable position because he's standing next to that car while you have cars approaching that aren't aware that there's an incident. Max is in a position where he has to get off the track. These other cars are approaching at 250 or 300 kilometers an hour, and there is debris everywhere. And if you pick up a
Mhm.
piece of debris, once again, there's nothing stopping you from experiencing a puncture and ending up a wall. It was a very, very poorly handled situation by the stewards in the FIA. And of all the things that they need to look at during this race, and there's a couple of things, right? Track configuration potentially. Obviously, Pirelli's going to have their ongoing study of the issues with the tires that led to both this crash and the Lance Stroll situation. But it was very, very frustrating. And for me, if this is a 6 kilometer track and it was a back marker that went off in a distance corner when it's rainy and dark and there were no immediate camera views,
Mhm.
this was somebody that was leading the race. We all saw it happen in real time. It's inexcusable that they couldn't deploy a safety car faster or at least caution the drivers as to what had happened. And we even heard as well, you heard the Red Bull team on the radio with the FIA
Mhm.
pleading for a red flag. And one, we rarely ever get that level of insight when you see the teams or hear the teams talking to the FIA, but they're screaming for a red flag, screaming that there's an issue with the tire, and screaming with the FIA to bring the cars into the pit so they have an opportunity to change their tires. It was very sloppy, very, very sloppy for sure.
Yeah, I'd completely forgotten about that. That was very unusual to hear the Red Bull pit wall, the sporting director on the radio to race director saying we had no warning, we had no idea this was going to
Yeah.
happen. There was still life in these tires, and we only knew it was happening when it happened. And I think that they laid it out perfectly, saying that give everybody the chance to come in and change these tires because I mean I guess Lance had been pushing his tires a little bit longer, but maybe not too much because I don't think that the set of tires that he used were that much older than say the
No.
life of the tire that Max had because if I'm correct, I think that Lance had his issue right in around lap 29 or
Lap
30.
29. Yep.
Yeah, so that's about 75% of the predicted life expectancy of those tires. They're saying that they should have been good for about 40 laps. So, I mean, he had at least another, you would think, 8 or 9 laps before they really got to that, the end of their life. I mean, you'd think at least another 5 or 6 at the very, very minimum. So that's why it was so shocking for both of them. But I wanted to get your take on something else. So Nico Rosberg, 2016 world champion, he's got his own YouTube channel. He's got his own podcast. He does some media work and stuff like that for the F1 broadcasts. Anyways, on his YouTube channel, in the run up to the race, he did a virtual lap around Baku. And I'll read out the exact comment that came out of Nico's stream. Anyways, he said, quote, I'm going to show you one of the places I've always found the most dangerous of the whole year. It was quite scary. You're arriving down here now at 350 kilometers per hour. No, look what's on the left. And he's
Yes.
talking about the
Yes.
pit entry at Baku. It was quite scary. Oh, sorry. Continuing, he says, imagine something breaks on the car. You're here at 350 kilometers per hour. On the left, there's just a wall and it's facing you. If something breaks and you're in that wall, it's the end. No more for you. This is just one of the most scariest places I've ever driven in an F1 car. To go by there just feels ridiculously wrong, but you have to try and blend it out. End quote. Anyways, Michael Massey, the F1 race director, he didn't agree with Nico and what he had to say because he says that the circuit has met all the FIA's grade 1 requirements for the circuit. Anyways, Massey had to say, quote, no, I disagree with that comment. The pit entry and the entire circuit has been designed and is homologated. That's a new word for me. I must admit.
I cannot say that word. I haven't ever been able to say that word.
Uh,
Homologation.
something like that. Anyways, by the FIA as a grade 1 circuit, it fulfills all of the various safety requirements that the FIA has within its regulation requirements. So, no, I disagree. But I mean, if you do look at some of the pictures there going down the pit straight, it does look a little bit more scary than I guess it is in real life. I mean, especially that there's no tire barriers there. I mean, it does sort of flare out. I mean, it's not like it's just like you'd hit it sort of end on. It is sort of angled, but there is a bit that sort of just sort of curls around the actual entry into the pits, and then there's tires and looks like crash barriers on the other side. But on the actual inside of the track on the left hand side, it's nothing. I mean, it looks like it's a barrier with some banners on it. Maybe there's some sort of tires behind it. It's kind of hard to see from from the pictures I'm looking at right now. But it is a bit scary looking. I mean, on one of the fastest sections of track that we see the entire year, I can completely appreciate what Nico Rosberg's talking about here.
I rarely ever agree or care about anything that Nico Rosberg says, but this is one of those cases where I have to agree with him. And we actually did post a photo of this. So we retweeted something that Tom Bellingham had posted earlier today, Tom from WTF1. I totally agree. It's not something that's obvious on television because you don't get that top down view. You're typically, the camera angle is probably more parallel. So it kind of just blends into the background. But there's two pieces here. One, Lance is lucky that his tire failure happened where it did, because if he was 250 meters farther down the track, it's very possible he may have been thrown into that. And if you
Mhm.
look at the footage, Max's tire failure began almost directly parallel or directly adjacent, although on the opposite side to the track, to this piece that you're kind of describing where the fence kind of bends inwards, the catch fence bends inwards into the pit. So I get it, right? Like if you're entering the pit, you know what, at that point, you're probably geared down and you're probably under 150 kilometers an hour. So if you have a tire failure, it's not going to be good, but it's not going to be catastrophic like it's at 300 kilometers an hour. Max was lucky because his track position, he was positioned on the right side of the track. Now, that said, even if he was on the right side of the track, when you have a tire failure like that, you have very little or no control over the direction of the car. You could easily be flung 50 meters across the track into that fence. I absolutely agree. And I encourage everyone to look at our Twitter feed because we did repost this and you'll see what we mean. Max, if he was probably a little bit more centered to the track, or if he'd been tracking on the left side of the track, and I don't think that's typically the racing line at Baku, but if he was, he could easily have been thrown. And it's one thing to make contact with a wall when you're racing parallel to it. It's another to make contact with a wall when you go straight into it. And that's potentially what could have happened here. And that's why it was so dangerous. And that's why I agree with Nico.
Yeah, it is interesting too. I mean, not that racing sims are any real indication of real life, but I did find it quite interesting. I mean, I've played the F1 game quite a bit. Not that I'm any good, but that's a completely different discussion. But it did help lend a bit of context after Grosjean's big crash at Sakir last year into that Armco barrier, which was sort of similar in a sense to Baku, where it was off to the one side of the track. It wasn't the pit entry; it was kind of an access road, and there was this Armco barrier that was it wasn't quite parallel to the track. It was sort of angled a little ways, and then there was an opening on one side, sort of on the against the flow of the circuit, so it could be accessed by service vehicles or a tow truck or whatever to remove a car from the track. However, I mean, that was different because the way that that crash unfolded and the way that Grosjean made contact and it threw his car over to the right like that, and then he basically went off the track and hit that section of Armco barrier at a right angle was something that they probably never foresaw because I did look at it doing some laps in the race sim, and it is quite far off of the track. And the one thing that I've noticed just playing the driving around the Baku City circuit is that when you come out of those final very sharp 90-degree corners, and then when you come back onto that start finish straightaway, I mean, there are it bends slightly a couple of times before it straightens out. And once you put the gas down and you're accelerating, those little flicks to the right each time come very, very quickly. And before you know it, you are at your top speed. And what you see this thing now is that it's completely raised a red flag to me that I'd never really been aware of before, because the racing line is more towards it's not really in the center, it's more over to the right hand side of the track, but it is a little bit scarier looking than I maybe had appreciated before now. Now, this is an interesting one. The next one, this comes from AlphaTauri team principal Franz Tost, who says that he believes that Yuki Tsunoda's pace at Baku was so fast, he was afraid that Yuki might actually have a crash. So, anyways, he said, "quote Yuki did a fantastic job, I must say. Okay, he had a small incident, but that was in Q3, and that can happen. It also happened to more experienced drivers. And today, his race pace was sometimes unbelievable. I was really worried that something happens because he was really fast. He is in a very good way, and I think he will come up with some good results also in the second half of the season when he gets a little bit more experience, especially on the tracks that he knows." End quote. So there you go. I don't know. I guess you could always have that opportunity to crash, especially if you're pushing it. But I've never actually heard it sort of put in that exact terminology or explained in such a way. But anyways, it was good to see Yuki have a good race again after having several very difficult ones after the opening round in Sorry, I was going to say in Baku and Bahrain earlier this spring. But
Mhm.
Yuki was not getting love for everyone because Andreas Seidel, who was the team principal at McLaren, said he was very well. He said he didn't agree with the way that race director Michael Massey decided not to take any action against Yuki Tsunoda and speeding during the double waved yellows after Max's crash there at the end of the race. Anyways, Michael Massey said that the entire field could have been penalized for not slowing under double yellows. In accordance with the sporting regulations. So I guess obviously Massey and the stewards were taking the view of, well, if I'm going to give it to one driver, then I'm going to have to give it to all of them except for Max, who's obviously in the in the concrete wall. So what's really the point? And then he did follow up because he was told that Sonoda's breach and speeding was obvious. To which he retorted, "Well, when it comes to penalties, they're all obvious, except for the ones that maybe need a little bit more examination." But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. We're going to take another break, and when we come back, is it time to delve into the mailbag? I
You know
know it's
what?
bursting at the seams, or
When we
no?
come back, I want to add a little bit of color to that Yuki
Sure.
comment,
Okay.
but then we can jump into the mailbag because I think we've got some
Awesome.
great questions this week.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's do that. We'll break here. We'll be back in a moment. So, guys, don't go away. We'll be right back. Okay, well, welcome back to the show. We're talking Formula One. We're talking Baku. We are talking Yuki Tsunoda, and you wanted to add a little bit more to what I was talking about just before the break there, and the calls from McLaren to, or their disagreements, their chagrin that Yuki was not penalized for speeding under the double waved yellows after Max's crash at the end of the race. So your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, far less interested in that, and more honestly, just interested in his pace and his racecraft. One, I love his personality, and I keep
Mhm.
talking about this, but every time I think about it, I start laughing. Which is that whole radio clip they played on the broadcast where the pit wall is saying "faster, faster, push harder," and you hear this pause, and then he screams back, "I am, shut up!" Like just the fact that you have this rookie driver telling the pit wall to shut up is hilarious to me. But to provide a little bit of context, because you talk about what his pace was, and that Toss and the rest of the AlphaTauri team were a little bit concerned about the pace and whether he was going to be able to keep that car out of the wall. To give a little bit of context, so not surprisingly, Max posted the fastest lap of 144.5. Sergio was second, 144.7. Lewis was third, 144.8. Sebastian Vettel was 144.9. Yuki had the fifth fastest lap at Baku at 144.9. So he was 0.4.5 seconds, 0.46 seconds off of Max. So there's still a pretty significant delta. But kudos to Yuki. This was obviously the first time he'd seen this track, and he scored points in Bahrain earlier this year. But from a Formula 2 driver, that's a track that they spend an extensive amount of time there. They do pre-season testing there, they do winter testing there, they do in-season testing there, they race there. It's a pretty conventional track. This is not an F2 track, so kudos to Yuki for bringing that car home safely. Kudos to him for coming home seventh, and kudos for him for putting in such a fantastic track time, because I think he's going to become a fan favorite. And I think the only other thing that I would add here too is, and there's kind of been a lot of commentary about this recently, is what's the future of the AlphaTauri team in Formula One? Obviously, they're not going anywhere, and their financial footing is very, very healthy. But if we're going into a cost cap era, there's nothing stopping Red Bull from positioning AlphaTauri as something other than a feeder team for Red Bull Racing. And if you potentially have Pierre Gasly, and I think we're probably going to see a long-term extension with him at that team at some point in the near future, and Yuki, you have a really really competitive, compelling driver lineup with a car that's matted to whatever this Honda power unit becomes, because these cars are incredibly fast. And Gasly obviously won a race in this car last year, and he scored a podium this weekend. Like, that's a team that I'm very, very excited about.
Yeah, it really is an interesting team to watch because I mean, like you say, I mean, prior to their branding as Alpha Tauri, I mean, they were Toro Rosso for years and years and years, and that totally was what that team was for, was just a development team. It was a junior team, basically to give Red Bull's academy drivers the opportunity to get minutes and races in Formula One to develop and mature with the ultimate goal to upgrade to the big team, which has not always worked out. Probably more in the recent future has not been as successful for them, as we've seen with the musical chairs with Gasly and Albon and Kvyat and Max himself. I mean, most of them making the round trip started at AlphaTauri slash Toro Rosso, going to Red Bull, and then ending back at AlphaTauri or Toro Rosso again, except Max Verstappen. And that's why the whole Sergio Perez discussion is so fascinating, right? Is because he is that one guy that came into the car, into the team from outside the system, and it's really kind of gone against their whole philosophy. So it really poses an interesting question. I mean, the car's good, the engine is obviously good, and in this cost cap era, and I guess more to the point is what is Red Bull going to do in the future with their own drivers, right? Are they still going to try and feed them through there? Because I mean, Pierre Gasly, I mean, he's a good Formula One driver. I mean, he obviously struggled at Red Bull. I mean, but I mean, he's won a race. He had a podium this past weekend, and I think he's had some pretty solid outings in this car, especially since he was switched back down there. I mean, 2020 was a good year for him, and it's fascinating. I mean, if we can see what Yuki does and how he develops over the course of the year, yeah, I don't know. It's going to be a fun one to watch.
Okay. Would you like to jump into some questions? I've got, and it's funny
Sure.
because I think that whole conversation we're just having kind of segues perfectly into this one. So let me just
Okay.
bring this up here. Da, 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 da. So the question is for a new fan. So this comes from Seth.
Okay.
For a new fan, perform a hard sell job on what team or driver or team and driver that new fan should watch. So we've got this great, excited, enthusiastic NBA fan in Seth. He's come over to the world of Formula One. He hasn't developed an allegiance yet. Sell him on a team, sell him on a driver. I'm curious to hear yours, and then I'm going to do mine.
Okay, I'm gonna go with McLaren. I'm gonna go with Lando Norris because I
Oh,
mean, yeah, I mean, you could go with Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes because I mean, why wouldn't you? I mean, if you want to see a driver that's won it all, that's won all the records, and he's got one of the best cars in Formula One, then that's the obvious choice. I mean, if you dig into it a little bit deeper, Lewis, how many years has he got left in Formula One? We don't know, right? But on the flip side, you've got a young, extremely exciting talent in Lando Norris. I mean, he's had some great results. I mean, he's really sort of found his feet over the last year, 18 months or so. And well, I mean, he had a very good rookie season, of course, but then you've got the interesting story about McLaren. And I mean, they're a team that's really come back. They've been resuscitated, brought back to life. After they switched from the Honda engines to the Renault, now they're back with Mercedes, where they had a partnership for a long, long time, and they had a lot of success as a constructor with those Mercedes engines. And well, I mean, they're obviously not in the position right now to win a race, but I feel that something special is brewing there. So maybe if you're the fan of the slow burn, almost, maybe this is something for you. Certainly, that's something that I have to admit that Lando is one of those drivers that I've really been keeping an eye on, and I get excited every time I see him have a good race out there. But that would be my call. I would go with Lando Norris and McLaren. Who
I
are you
think that's a
going with?
I think that's a really good call, right? Like, this is a team of the future. It's a team of the present. It's got a couple of exciting drivers. There's some great legacy there. The cars look great on track. I came into this thinking I was going to hard sell Seth on the Williams team.
Hmm.
In
Oh, that's a hard sell.
hindsight, yeah, yeah, totally. Like, in hindsight, I kind of feel like I would be day trader based out of a chop shop on Long Island in 2000 selling somebody in Kansas penny stock. Like I felt bad doing it. Like I love Williams for all the reasons that people know. I don't see them hitting I don't see them hitting a stride anytime soon. And hopefully that changes next year. And hopefully Latifi's able to enjoy some success. So, as much as I have an emotional investment in that team, I'm really struggling to sell somebody on making that their allegiance. So, for me, I actually changed. So, I came into this planning to talk about Williams, and I felt a little bit guilty doing that. But now I'm all in on Alpha Tauri. And I think the principal reason is one, you've got two young, super exciting drivers, one who's already run a race, one who's doing relatively well as a rookie, but is an exciting individual with a great personality. And I think, and we talked about this a couple of minutes ago, Alpha Tauri or Toro Rosso was already trapped in this position where it was never going to be anything but Red Bull's B team. Like at the end of the day, Red Bull, from a financial perspective, couldn't care less if they scored any championship points. It was simply there as a pathway to develop their drivers from their lower academy into that Red Bull seat. So when they bring one of their driver academy products into a Red Bull car, they're already Formula One season. They know the tracks, they're used to the grip, they're used to the mechanicals, they're used to the brakes. But I now I'm kind of the perspective that as the economics and the structure of the sport changes going into 2022 and the regulations are different, ultimately this could be a competitive team. And if I'm Red Bull now, I'm looking at it's like, we could have our Red Bull team, which is our premier team, but we could also have a second team that could possibly serve two purposes. One, it could house our younger, talented drivers. But with this new power unit that we're continuing to develop, they themselves can be competitive. And now we could possibly cash in with two teams scoring big championship points for the first time ever. And again, it's always been designed by design, right? Like they've always sacrificed the performance of Toro Rosso, Alpha Tauri, so they could move those drivers into the bigger squad. But all of a sudden, I'm in a position where Alpha Tauri could be pretty exciting. And also, I just love the white wheels. There's something about white
Yeah.
wheels on a Formula One car that's a total turn on for me. So, Seth, I'm all in on Alpha Tauri, and you're all in on McLaren.
You do realize that the two choices we made were the ultra hipster kind of like insider tip kind of thing. I mean, the correct answer was go with Mercedes, go with Ferrari because they always going to have the best drivers. They're going to have
Yeah,
the chances to win. The merch looks great. I mean, you could
yeah,
throw Aston Martin into that one as well because their merch looks great. I mean, they're all luxury brands, although you do look
totally.
like a bit of a poser if you're rocking all like the Ferrari merch and you show up in your 1998 Honda Civic that's got like a mismatched door, a door panel or something, and is belching smoke out the back. But
But you know what's the only thing that's worse than showing up wearing your Ferrari merch in a 1998 Honda Civic is showing up wearing Ferrari merch, driving your merch or driving a Ferrari. Like that's the worst thing ever. It's like somebody who gets off of their Ducati motorbike and they're wearing Ducati jacket and helmet and pants and gloves. It's a bad look. But I'm glad we were able to share our thoughts on what team to become emotionally invested in.
cool. All right, that was a great one. Next question or comment, or should we dive? I've got one in here in
Go
the
for
in
it.
the
Yeah, yeah, go
mailbox.
for it.
Okay, this is from John Eminger in New York City. Anyways, or just in New York. I don't know if he's actually in New York City. Anyways, Jen DTS here, and this is my first full season of watching live races. I was curious of what you both think about Mick Schumacher and how you see his Formula One career playing out. As a relatively new fan, I was always aware of the Schumacher name and is undeniably still carries a ton of weight in the world of motorsport. I know there have been rumors that a seat with Ferrari would be inevitable, but given the unknown status of Hamilton and Bottas, could Mick make a play against Russell for one of the Mercedes seats?
Huh.
Also, how do you think he stacks up against the other young drivers who've already found success in Formula One, Leclerc, Norris, Sainz, Verstappen, etc.? Thank you both for the great content, John in New York. You were making a couple of the gears are already turning. I can see. So why did you take this one? I've got my own 2 cents I want to throw into this one as well.
I'm going to let you go first because I'm
Sure.
still trying to formulate a response. It's a
Okay, no
great
problem.
question, but I'm still trying to formulate a response.
It is. So I'm going to answer the second part of the question first because I think that that will kind of lead into where I'm going to go with that potential of an open seat at Mercedes. So, second part of John's question was he wanted to know how we think that Mick lines up against these other young generations of drivers like Charles, Lando, etc. Right? Um, I I think for me it's too early to say. I think it's undeniable that he's a very good driver, but I think the one thing that's the X factor for me really making an out and out I guess the definitive call on this is just the handicap that he has in driving the Haas is because the car is not competitive. It's not very fast, obviously, and he's
Yeah.
not really challenging anybody. I mean, we did see him kind of mixing up in Portugal a couple of weeks ago, a couple of races back, and he was fighting for some places, obviously well outside of the points. So I mean, he has shown some things. I mean, he's still only six races into his Formula One career, and I think that for anyone, Ferrari and even Mercedes, I mean, the obvious link, like he makes, is that link to Ferrari because he's in the Ferrari Academy and all that. And let's face it, there would be 20. Well, I mean, there's more than 20 drivers that would want one of those Mercedes seats, but I think that decision will be a lot easier for them to make because I think, unfortunately, if you're Mick Schumacher, if that one of those seats comes open at the end of the year, I think it's just the right opportunity, just way too soon, right? I think that obviously those other comparisons are going to be made, and those parallels are going to be drawn with guys like George Russell, right? And we've talked about that before. And obviously, I mean, he's got the link being a Mercedes driver. He's come through their whole system, and he's was the reserve driver. He was the reserve driver for Mercedes at one point, wasn't he, for a season?
Yeah.
Or am I?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, he's really got the links there, and I think that just because of the legacy and the pedigree and the whole legendary status of the family name Schumacher carries in Formula One, that I think there would be a lot of excited people to see a Schumacher in a Ferrari and see what he would be able to do. Could he match what his dad did for all those years at Ferrari 2 decades ago? I mean, yeah, that's a great question, but I think basically it's too soon to make a call on Mick.
I agree. And I think you make a really good point about the fact that he's in a car that is so woefully uncompetitive. It's really challenging to understand what his strengths and his weaknesses are. And this is where I struggle a little bit as well. And I know this wasn't the question, but I struggle a little bit with George Russell in the sense that
Hmm.
there's a lot of people that are very excited about George Russell. Ultimately, he's in a terrible car at the back of the field, and I get it. He's consistently outqualified his teammates and finished a place or two ahead of them, but it's very difficult to gauge how talented he is. And ultimately, that's not his fault because he's cursed with one of the worst cars in Formula One. Mick, meanwhile, is in a very similar situation where it's difficult to gauge where he is from a developmental perspective. I think at least for Mick, it's year one, right? So the transition to Formula One is a very significant one. And I remember having a conversation with Nicholas Latifi a couple of years ago when he was still in Formula Two, but he was testing Formula One cars. And I'd asked him at the time, like, I'm like, man, what is the principal distinction between an F2 car and an F1 car? He said, it's honestly, man, he's like, it's just so difficult to come to grasp the sheer amount of mechanical grip and the braking speeds. He's like, it's not something you learn in a weekend. It's not something that you learn in a month. It's something you have to learn with time. So for Mick, I think this is maybe a good transitionary year in the sense that, hey, he's in Formula One, he's with Haas. There's no expectations whatsoever. He can learn the car, learn the tracks, come to grips with the structure of a Formula One car. Like, maybe this is good. What I worry about is I don't want to see him in a position where he's like George Russell, buried with a back marker for 3 years, because whether George deserves it or not, isn't helping his development. Whatever he was going to learn with that team and that car, he learned 2 years ago. So hopefully with Mick, he gets a shot. And if not with Ferrari, because I think that's doubtful, because I think they're fairly happy with their pairing, I think ultimately it would probably be a good move to get him to Alfa Romeo, because Alfa Romeo, again,
Hmm.
part of the Ferrari family, I think it would be really good for them from a marketing perspective. Kimi can't hold on forever. And I think a lot of people criticize Kimi because he's still in the sport, but I think Alfa Romeo needs him as much as he needs Formula One at this point, simply because he provides a ton of value to them from a marketing and a sponsorship perspective, to be able to say, hey, we have a Formula World champion driving our car. But I think Mick would potentially offer that same value from a marketing and advertising perspective. My hope is that Mick gets away from Haas as soon as possible. I don't see the upside for that team. They're not investing in the car. I don't know that they're investing heavily in the 2022 car, but I think
Hmm.
Mick could be good. I just think he needs to be away from that team as quickly as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. You make some great points there, and also That lines up very nice with an email that we got from JJ in Houston. I've been saving that one for the opportune time, and I haven't forgotten about you, JJ. I'm going to keep that one in my back pocket for a couple more days, and we'll talk about it on the next show on Monday night. Anyways, Mark, let's take another break here, and then we'll come back and we'll get another batch of fresh tweets and whatever else. And we'll do so in just a moment. So, guys, don't go away. We're not going anywhere. And we'll be back in just a few moments. So, don't go away. All right. Well, welcome back to the podcast. As always, up to speed with Formula One, and we're in the mailbag right now. We're going over your tweets and messages, or just a selection. We could literally do this every day, night of the week. I'm sure we could with the volume of messages and emails that we get from you guys, which is absolutely fantastic. Anyways, who's on deck?
I've got a great one. So this comes from at Texas Tech Sean. So I'm presuming I presume Sean is a fan of Texas Tech and all things collegiate in Texas. This is a really interesting question. And I think this one deserves a little bit of context. And I'll kind of let you tee this one up. But had Schumi stayed a couple more years, where do you think Lewis would have ended up? And do you think Mercedes would still have become as dominant? Did Schumi, so being Michael Schumacher, did he have another title or two in him at that time when he left Formula One?
Yeah, isn't that a great question? I don't know. That really is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, and
I'm not sure how to answer that one. To be quite honest, I would like to. I would like to think, just considering how great of a driver Schumacher was, that perhaps he did leave a title or two on the table. But you have to remember, at that point in his career, he was
42.
yeah, I mean, he was already up there quite, not that 42 is very old, but I mean, I think he was beyond the peak there, and I think that maybe he himself knew that, and I think that's why he pulled the plug and stepped away when he did. I think that he was really sticking around at that point to really help get that program up and running, and really
Totally
help
agree.
that team to really find their feet, and just lend all his experience and all his knowledge and everything that he'd accomplished in Formula One. I mean, it's possible, but I don't think so. I think that's why it was such a great move for Lewis, because I think it was the perfect opportunity at the right time, and he was just the right guy to take it.
I agree with everything you say. And I think for our American fans, our North American fans, I think the best way to kind of pitch this is think about Michael Schumacher as Michael Jordan after he'd run off that second three-peat. He'd won
Great
three
point.
titles. And you think about Michael Schumacher, he'd won the title in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, run off five in a row. He finished third with a really, really disappointing, surprisingly disappointing Ferrari car in 05. He finished second in 06, and then he retired. So he retired, I would say close to the peak, right? He'd won 7 championships and he kind of went out on top. He wasn't a back marker. He was still contending for race wins and podiums, but he retired. And then he came back in 2010, and he came back just like you said, because he wanted to help start up the Mercedes Grand Prix program. So Mercedes had stepped in. They purchased the Braun GP team at the end of 2009. They branded it the Mercedes team. He finished ninth in 2010. He finished eighth in 2011. And then he slipped all the way to 13th in 2012, despite a podium. And I agree with you. Like, it's nice to kind of romanticize the fact that, hey, maybe if he'd stuck around a couple more years, he would have been in contention. But you think 2013, Mercedes didn't win a title with Rosberg and Hamilton, and that was the last year of the V8 era. 2014, you go into the turbo hybrid V6 era. They win that year, but you do the math, and at that point, he's 44, man. He's pushing 45 years old, and that's asking a lot for anybody, let alone somebody that at that point would have been in the sport for 20 plus years. It's an absolute grind. I don't think so. I think he would have done a disservice to the team. I think he left absolutely at the right time. I think he helped get the program started. He provided a ton of data, a ton of insight, and a ton of feedback into the car. Of course, everything that happened after that is terrible, but ultimately, I don't think he was winning any titles, and I think he probably would have held the team back just based on his age.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because when I think about Schumacher, I always kind of think there's two portions to his career, because he did have that retirement in between. You have the Ferrari Benetton era, and of course
Yeah,
when he came into Formula One, that legendary weekend in Spa for the Jordan
yeah.
team that really kind of took the whole world by surprise and really launched him onto the into the consciousness of the Formula One world, right?
Yeah.
And everything that he accomplished, the two world championships with Benetton, and then moving to Ferrari when they still really weren't at their peak. I mean, he went there obviously at a time where they were still building, and what they accomplished with Braun and with Jean Todt and Rory Byrne and all these amazing people that they had working in the team at that time. I mean, the record speaks for itself. And I mean, even Rubens Barrichello had some good moments in that car as well, right? And then, yeah, I mean, he retires and he comes back, and that's I sometimes see it as two different Schumachers. When you see the two different points to his career. But I totally agree. I think that he did ultimately walk away at the right time and decide that I think for the reasons that you pointed out that he might have held them back. And you have to remember too is that at that point, I mean, Red Bull were at their strongest. I mean, Seb won what, 4 titles in a row. I mean, they weren't invincible like Mercedes are or have been in this hybrid era, but they were the dominant team in and around just before the switch over to the turbo hybrid engine. So yeah, great question.
Cool. Have you got anything? I've got a couple more, but I want to make sure I give you the opportunity to tee one up if you got anything.
No, we'll go back to the tweets. The ones I've got
Cool.
in the mailbag are they deserve some more time, so I'm going to save those for Monday night.
Cool. And these are good because they're kind of quick, fast, punchy questions, but I love this one. So this comes from
Okay.
Tanner Allen. And this is a great question, especially based on what we saw this weekend and in Baku. But here's the question. So why is it that Pirelli is the only tire company interested in F1? It feels like it would be good marketing. Obviously, he means for another team or another company to be involved. Is it because the only time we really pay attention to the tire company is when things go wrong? That's actually a really interesting question.
Yeah, it is. And I think I tweeted at the time when I was watching the race on Sundays. I think I said, well, I guess nobody's buying Pirellis on Monday because, the old saying, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Right. And I think that I think that's more, for the, NASCAR and Indy and stuff like that, especially stock car racing where, you can see somebody driving to Monte Carlo, you win driving to Monte Carlo, and they're going to be selling Monte Carlos on Monday morning, for example. But yeah, it really is true. I mean, for a time there, we did have multiple tire manufacturers in Formula One. We had Bridgestone, we had Goodyear. I mean, and at times we have had just a single tire manufacturer. I guess it really depends who's really interested in participating. I mean, if you go back to the well, not really all that long ago when you had Bridgestone and Goodyear involved in the sport, that one was always better than the other, and sometimes it was the difference between the two tires offered by the different manufacturers was really quite it was really quite massive. So I think that when it comes to the fact that we only have Pirelli now, yeah, I guess from one point of view, it kind of maybe doesn't look that great because of well, they're the only people that want to get involved with Formula One. But at least when everybody's on the same type of rubber, at least from that point of view, the table's leveled, right? So that
Yeah.
there is no distinct disadvantage to having Firestones or Goodyears or Pirellis or whatever it might be, right? I mean, it would be kind of cool to kind of open it up, but personally, I like the fact that there is only one tire provided, or there's only one tire manufacturer, and then it comes down to the combination of car, engine, and driver. Well, there's still
Yeah.
quite a few things going on there, but it's just that if you start to add too many variables in there, then that's a lot to try and make a competitive package. But it's a great question, and it's really one to kind of ponder over and think about.
You did such a great job summarizing this. I don't know that I necessarily have a lot to add. I would add, of course, that to your point, there have been moments in history where you had multiple manufacturers supplying tires. So
Yeah.
teams would go and negotiate with different tire manufacturers for tires. Until the end of 2006, I think we had Goodyear and Michelin
Hmm.
producing Formula One tires. I think the challenge for Formula One is right now, one, there aren't a lot of companies that are particularly interested. It's a hugely expensive exercise to produce and feed tires to Formula One teams. And the listener Tanner makes a really good point as well that oftentimes we only mention tires when something goes wrong. There's degradation issues, there's puncture issues, the tires are collapsing. Like you get a lot of heat and a lot of bad press being associated with Formula One. Ultimately, I think the biggest piece is that if you go back to 2003, 4, 5, 6, there was a massive tire war in the sport and costs were escalating. And then ultimately, it really culminated in 2005 at the US Grand Prix, where you had teams show up and one set of teams had one tire and one set of teams had another tire. And I'm not going to go into the specifics now, but I highly encourage everyone to go and check YouTube for the 2005 US Grand Prix. But ultimately, one of the sets of teams that were relying on one tire brought a tire to the track, and the manufacturer hadn't equipped that tire with the capabilities to survive the load in one of the bank turns, and
Mhm.
ultimately a large group of teams, 7 of the 10 teams, in fact, couldn't actually compete or wouldn't compete for safety reasons. And the race was run with 3 teams and 6 cars, and it effectively broke Formula One in the US until 2012, really until 2015. So
Yeah.
I don't think Formula One wants that. And you added another point that I'd never thought about as well. Having a single tire supplier really feeds into this whole premise of a cost cap and controlling a cost. But it's also a really great point that I'd never thought of. It adds a degree of parity, right? Like there would be nothing worse than having everything right, a great car, a great driver, a great aero package, and then just happening to sign a contract with the worst tire supplier and having your entire season derailed because of that one decision. I think I like where we are now, and I think you agree.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Cool. All right. Would you like another question, or do we have time before another break?
Well, let's just take a quick break here. This is a good spot for it, and then we'll dive back in. I still have a
Cool.
bunch of news stories I want to talk about when we come back, and we still got plenty of time. You know, it's almost weekend, so why not hang out a little bit longer and talk Formula One? And we
Cool.
will pick up the conversation on the flip side. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to the show. First, before we get back into it, just a quick shout out to Kiefer and Alexis in Connecticut saying hi on the YouTube stream. Kind of cool for people to check in there. It's kind of neat that we've been live streaming recently and good fun. So we should, if we had a more set schedule, people could actually know when to look for us. But that's more on me than on you. So let's move on. What's up next?
So here's one question, and this is more of a general question that we get from a lot of our listeners. And the question is really driven around the concept of the salary cap. And it's something that we actually talked about a lot on the live chat last night. And it's
Hmm.
something that in North America, I think we're conditioned to, right? Like if you look at the structure of North American sports, in the NFL, they have a collective bargaining agreement. They've got a very fiercely managed salary cap. Likewise, in the NHL, they had a lockout back in, I think it was 2005. They lost an entire season because the owners were so intent on implementing a salary cap. The NBA's had a salary cap for decades, and they revisit with on regular intervals when the collective bargaining agreement expires. The last time, unfortunately, there wasn't a labor disruption. But in North America, we're conditioned to this concept. In
Hmm.
Europe, they're not. So the funny thing is, when we talk about a driver salary cap, our listeners in Europe are up in arms. Like, what is this salary cap? This is terrible. Why would you restrain the teams from being able to spend as much money as they want? Because in European football, that concept of a salary cap is totally foreign. In North America, the sense that I get from our listeners is, yeah, makes total sense. Implement a salary cap, but I think I've shared via the live chat and Twitter quite a bit my thoughts on a salary cap, but I think a lot of the listeners kind of want your sense and your perspective on, is salary cap good for the sport? How do you think it should work? And do you think the drivers would ultimately accept it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it is a good idea because I mean the way that spending has been going in Formula One. I mean it's nothing new. I mean it's all relative into whatever era you look at it. It doesn't matter if it's right now in the 2020s or the 2000s or the 90s, the 80s, the 70s. The thing is, I mean, there's always been unrestrained spending, and especially in this day and age, I mean, it's just gotten to the point where it is completely I think unmanageable. And I think that was really highlighted just over a year ago when the whole pandemic started. And all of a sudden, okay, you're not going to have people in seats. You know, there's no guarantee we're even going to get a season going. And then even if we do get a season going, we're probably not going to get people coming in. So maybe we'll be able to broadcast the races from behind closed doors. So there might be some, TV revenue. So I mean, they had this opportunity to really look at this up close. I mean, there've been talks about it for a while, but nothing ever came of it. I think basically because Bernie was in charge of the sport for so long, and I think his attitude was either you have enough money to be in Formula One, if you don't, too bad, go spend your money somewhere else, or don't spend it at all, right? But in this day and age, I mean, that's a bit too much of a cavalier attitude to have. And the point is, I mean, you could be, say, one of the small teams in Formula One and still be spending tens, or in some cases, maybe upwards of $100 billion or pounds or euros or more, and you could still be a totally crappy, garbage, sucky team, and getting a terrible ROI on on the money that you're putting in there, because you've got teams like Ferrari and Mercedes who are spending upwards of $500 million or more per year on their teams and their drivers and everything. So I think it's just a logical step. I mean, if you're going to put the cost cap in on the back end, on the R&D, the size of the organization, the amount of money that they have to run a Formula One team, that's going to be on this sliding scale. It's going to, what are we at this year? 145 million or something?
145, yeah.
Yeah, so it's going to scale down over the next couple of years till they hit the floor that they want to get to, $130 million. And I think that the next step is that if you're going to have the cost cap, then the driver salary thing makes sense. I mean, does this mean that these drivers should take a pay cut? No, but I think that there should be some, there should be some limit as to what they can spend. And I think we've sort of tossed around some ideas before that, I don't know, maybe you get 25 or 50 million or whatever it is, period. And then, for drivers, and then it's up to you to decide, do I want to give 40 million to one guy and 10 to another, or whatever, that hard cap space is. And it still blows my mind. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago, the fact that all these drivers' salaries are, they're all locked away at some secret vaults in Geneva, and only a handful of people who know the secret handshake can actually get in and see these things. And you know, I can understand from one point of view that that these guys don't want their business being published out there, but I don't know. I always find it interesting when you hear the terms of a deal of a what's LeBron making, or what's Tom Brady's new contract with the Buccaneers, like, or whoever it is, right? You always like to hear these things, or sometimes you see these ridiculous contracts handed out in the NHL. I mean, it's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but as a sports fan, I kind of enjoy that too. Just trying to see, okay, this is the team. Like, how are the Yankees going to build a team to make a run at the World Series, or the Lakers, or whoever, right? So whatever sport, I kind of find a certain nerdy attraction in knowing those numbers and what people are making, and just because you always see in some of the North American sports how some teams have gotten themselves into bad situations because they've handcuffed themselves with bad deals, and they don't have the cap space, or they don't have the wiggle room to get out of some of these deals, and build a competitive team. But I guess it's a little bit different if you're looking at a roster for an NHL team compared to a Formula One team that has $130 million a year to develop and build a car, and then say $30 billion cap for driver's salary. So there are some differences there, but in a long roundabout way, then yes, I guess I am in favor of a driver salary cap.
And ultimately, and I think you did a fantastic job of summarizing your thoughts and what the potential impact would be if we went into an era where it was a 20 million, say 20 million euro or $20 million salary cap, or whatever the number is.
Hmm.
Ultimately, there aren't a lot of drivers that are going to be impacted by this. And I think the way that you could sell it to the drivers is this: like, look, guys, we need to implement a salary cap for this reason. But the promise is we're also going to have a salary floor, because if you look at Formula
Yeah.
One this year, and this was something that, and I don't know how reputable this is as a tabloid, but if you're to believe the Irish Mirror, the yearly earnings of F1 drivers in 2021, their base salary. So Hamilton's at 22 million pounds, Max is at 19 million, Fernando's at 15, Seb's at 11, Daniel's at 11. Ultimately, if the salary cap is going to be 20 million pounds or $30 million or whatever the case is, there's really only 4 or 5 drivers that would be impacted by this, right? And
Hmm.
these are some drivers, with the exception of Max, that are probably on the backside of their career. Fernando for sure, Seb for sure, Lewis for sure. And then if you look at the bottom of the earnings as well, it's shocking how some of these drivers make. So Yuki, it's speculated his contract for this year is £364,000. So under a million US, maybe close to 600,000 or 700,000 US. Latifi 730, Nikita 730, although they're both technically paid drivers, so they don't really care. Mick's earning 730, Giovinazzi is earning 730, Russell's at 730, Esteban Ocon's at 3.6 million pounds, so about 5 million, 6 million US. Like the earnings aren't huge. So ultimately, if they did implement a 20 million or $30 million US salary cap, the impact's going to be pretty negligible. And then the
Mhm.
way you can these drivers is like, hey, you know what, might impact a few of you at the top end, but ultimately, if we implement a salary floor, it could benefit all of you. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. And if it helps bring cost certainty to the sport, then that's a great thing. And ultimately, if I'm Lewis or if I'm Fernando, and this is the point that Charlie and Andre were making yesterday when we were talking in the Twitter, is ultimately it's going to make sure that the drivers make their decisions about teams based on winning potential, because even though your earnings might be flat, your marketability and your promotional opportunities might be greater because you're with a winning team. So, hey,
Yeah.
maybe you're not earning that through your paycheck with the team, but maybe you can go and sell yourself to Wheaties or Pepsi or Coke or whoever the case ultimately might be out
Hey,
there. So,
you stole. I was actually going to say that that I was going to make that that
oh, I'm
exact the
sorry.
endorsement like opportunities that maybe you know you hit the maximum the salary cap, but
It's how they do it in NASCAR,
yeah,
man. In
they
NASCAR,
get your
that's how they
face
make
on
their
the
money.
box of Wheaties, and then
Yeah.
there you go. So great minds think alike. So moving on, what's the next one?
So here's a great one. I'm going to let you take this one. So
Sure.
this comes from, oh my gosh, hold on. Let me make sure. I want to make sure I get his name right. So his Twitter name is Veb Settle, which I always get a chuckle out of, but at Big Dumb Rocket. So I believe it's one of our Canadian listeners based out of the Atlantic provinces.
Which I
Listen,
believe, before I'm not sure if it's Web Settle, but before it used to be Hall and Oates, and I got this really kind of like crazy, kind of like a fanboy moment, thinking that maybe it was Daryl Hannah or whatever, John Oates actually listening to the show, right, or
no,
Daryl Hall or whatever,
we
right?
have some we have some, and this is going to be a subtle flex, but we certainly have some verified listeners on Twitter. But here's the question. You have to listen. I had to read this a couple times to understand it, even though it's phrased perfectly.
Hmm.
Either a question for the mailbag or just one to throw out on Twitter.
Sure.
If you could choose one field, so I think by that he means like one era of driver, one field of drivers that were racing at the same time. If you could choose one field from the past to race on a track that wasn't around then. So let's say it's a field of drivers from the past that could race on a track from today. Which era would you take those drivers from? And what track would you put them on?
Yeah, that's a great one. You did send this one to me before, so I've had the opportunity to think about this, and I'm going to kind of go back. I'm going to go old school on this one, like really old school. So I'm going to pick up the class of drivers that included Ayrton Senna, Alain Prost, Nigel Mansell, Nelson Piquet, Gerhard Berger, Jean Alesi. You know, sort of like late '80s, early '90s. And I thought long and hard about this one, but I'd throw them all out into Baku. Just because,
Oh,
yeah, yeah. I mean, there was some really, some really hard fought racing in that class of drivers, and put them onto a track like Baku City that has, some interesting challenges and unique properties into that circuit, on its own. But I would love to see those guys out there racing on that track. I mean, I really had to think about that. How many of these tracks weren't around back then? I mean, Australia was, but that would have been in
Adelaide.
Adelaide rather than
Yeah.
Melbourne. And then I thought about some of the other ones like Singapore. I mean, Singapore's a cool track. I mean, it's a city circuit again, but I wasn't feeling that one as much as say Baku, just because you have some very unique and contrasting characteristics on that circuit compared to Singapore, for example. I mean, that's got a very city circuit vibe to it, whereas Baku doesn't. And I was thinking about some of the other ones. I mean, Sakir is an interesting track. So was Turkey. I even gave sort of momentary thought and consideration to Mugello from last year, even though that was a temporary track. But I kept coming back to Baku City. How
Uh,
about yourself?
Oh, that's such a good answer. I couldn't come up with an era or a track, because what I couldn't wrap my head around is, while we do this, do
Mhm.
we want them driving their cars on today's track, or do we want to put them into today's cars? Because that for me would almost be the more interesting thing to see. So I guess for context, today's cars are faster, they're grippier, They stop quicker than anything that these drivers would have known. But the perception is that they're possibly easier to drive, even though they don't have a ton of driver aids. I sense that those cars in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, I sense that the steering was heavy, braking was exhausting, shifting gears was like you were physically shifting and putting in
Mhm.
a clutch. The experience of driving the cars in the 70s and the 80s and 90s is totally different than today. Now, the difference today is that even though the cars don't have a ton of luxurious driver aids, they don't have air conditioning, they don't have traction control, they don't have a lot of these things that we would see in a road car, but you still don't have to worry about a clutch pedal. You don't have to worry about shifting gears or missing a gear or grinding gears or getting stuck in neutral. Everything, like all the gear changes happen in the blink of an eye at the steering wheel. But that said, so as much as the cars make life a little bit easier for the drivers, I think the G forces and the speeds are something that those drivers from previous eras would have to adapt to. So I think what I would be more interested in seeing is if you gave those drivers from a previous era a year to condition and learn to drive those cars, how would they perform? I would be very, very curious to see how a PK or a Senna or a Prost or not JV. JV annoys me. Or any of those great drivers from kind of the late 80s and the early 90s. I'd love to see how they would excel in a car today. And then of course the other piece too is the cars are just much bigger, so they're far less maneuverable. But yeah, this is a really good question. We could probably talk about this forever. So I don't have an answer, but what I
Yeah.
would like to see is that same era of drivers that you mentioned in a modern car.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. That was a twist that I never actually thought of. I actually just thought to take those guys from like the late '80s and '90s and put them in their cars into onto Baku City and see how they would do. But yeah, I mean, you raise a really great point. Sure, there are a ton of driver aids that these cars have that they didn't have then. I mean, if you time traveled back in time and sat down and started talking about things like MGUKs and
Yeah.
MGUHs and engine maps and things like that. They'd be looking at you, like you're speaking English words, but I don't understand what any of them mean, kind of thing. But yeah, that
Totally.
would be kind of cool to take that class of drivers in their prime and throw them into these cars and see how long it would take for them to adapt. Great call.
And
Yeah.
that's really always the debate with North American sports, right? Is like, what if you took that great NBA player, that great baseball player from the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, and you put them into the modern era and you allowed them the benefit of today's medical capabilities and scientific knowledge and nutritional information and training regimens? Because, you look back at the NBA and Major League Baseball in the 50s and the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, they're smoking in the dugout, they're smoking in the clubhouse in between innings and at halftime, right? Like, just the understanding of medical science was very different. But Formula One was exactly the same thing. Like, you see these photos of James Hunt sitting on the car between practice sessions, drinking a beer and eating his lunch out of the lunchbox with his shirt off. Like, it was a very, very different era. And I'm sure some of the drivers would adapt beautifully, but I think there's probably an equal number that wouldn't be able to adapt to the current standards of sports science and nutrition, etc.
You know what? Just before we move on to the next one, I mean, the way that I see this one going is which athlete would you like to see into that car? And I'm going to go with Shaq. No matter how big these cars are, they would still be like slippers for Shaq. He could put one Formula One car on each foot, and there you go.
That's so. And by the way, Shaq is a hilarious follow on social media, and I love the work that he does on TNT with Kenny and Charles in the group. He's a guy that shows up with zero prep whatsoever. He makes these terrible, terrible takes, and often they're unfounded, and he gets players. Anyways, he's hilarious. I love Shaq.
I love Shaq too. Okay, moving on. What's up next?
So this one's a little bit unrelated to F1, but it comes up quite often because I think we tease a little bit of our interest in professional sports. But one of the questions we get quite often is, what sports teams do you follow? So what are your favorite teams in the big leagues? What football club do you follow? And I think I would let you go first.
Oh, I'm a huge sports guy. Like, it's not just Formula One. That's obviously one of my passions. But you can see I'm rocking the Team Canada sweater today for ice hockey. I was just before I came down, I was upstairs watching the Colorado Avalanche and the Vegas Golden Knights in the NHL playoffs. We're in Vancouver, so I'm a big hockey fan. I've been a Canucks fan my whole life. When it comes to football, I'm a Seahawks fan. No shame in saying that. And you can say, okay, well, you probably just a fair weather fan that jumped on after they won the Super Bowl. No, I'll go upstairs. I will pull out the Rick Meyer shirt out of
Kingdom,
my
baby.
yeah Kingdom. I will pull out the Rick Meyer jersey, so I'll go up and step up on that one, and also. yeah, I love baseball, love football, obviously, soccer. A big fan of Manchester United. They're always my favorite team. You know, the reason why I picked Man United is because everybody in my family hated Man United. I'm like, they're the team everybody hates, so that's the team I'm going to cheer for. So horrible logic on that one. And of course, Vancouver Whitecaps, which is a team that I covered for years and years in Vancouver. Not so much or at all these days, but certainly I always enjoyed watching Whitecaps. And also a big fan of professional cycling. This is a great year for cycling. We just had the Giro d'Italia just last month. The Tour de France is coming up. We got the Olympics and the cycling. Look forward in that, and then the Vuelta de España coming up in September. So basically, when it comes to sports, I pretty much watch it all. I have the problem that I can't even sit down and enjoy all the sports I want to because other things get in the way. I didn't
It's
even mention baseball yet either. So
Oh man, it's challenging in your case too, and I won't share the exact number, but you have a large collection of children, so you have to manage your time very very carefully. So I don't even know how you consume the sports that you do consume.
well, I try and manipulate them into it's a good way to spend family time, and that hey, that sports is on. Let's go watch the hockey game, or let's go watch the ball game, and hope that they will become sports fans themselves, and that it becomes a bit of an easier sell rather than getting these really really icy stares from other members of the family.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'll quickly share. I think mine as well. So I'm also a big sports fan. I spent a lot of my youth in the UK, so I have a natural affinity for Arsenal, and it's not because of any specific reason other than the fact that typically in families, and it's funny because in your case, your family was opposed to the team that you liked, and that was the team that you adopted. But in my case, I became an Arsenal fan just because that kind of ran in the blood and it was accessible and people would talk about it and things like that. When we moved to North America, it was right about the time that the Toronto Blue Jays were, I guess it was shortly after they moved into Skydome, so around like 89, 90.
Mhm.
So they were exceptional. In Canada, we didn't have a ton of sports TV. So back then we had a single sports network, TSN, and almost every Toronto Blue Jays game was on there. So no matter where you lived in Canada, the Toronto Blue Jays were super accessible. They were super exciting. They were just stacked from a talent perspective. So I was a huge Toronto Blue Jay fan. And of course, early on, they won a World Series in 92 and 93 before they disappeared from relevance for 4 or 5 years before regaining a little bit of relevance. But I remained a big baseball fan. I played baseball at some very, very competitive levels. I didn't get drafted, despite some interest from some West Coast teams. So that was still a little bit heartbreaking. But ultimately, I got to play baseball at some pretty high levels. I was a big fan of baseball during the late 90s and the early 2000s. And I was all in on the performance enhancing drug era because I was such a big fan of the offense. But I am also a huge, huge NBA fan. And I fell in love with the NBA when the NBA expanded to Vancouver and Toronto in 95. And I was the biggest diehard Grizzlies fan in the world. I taped every game, I watched every game, I read the box scores, I was obsessed. And in 1999, so people forget this because the team ultimately moved to Memphis in 2001 after the 2001 season, but they were actually bought in 99 by the San or the oh my goodness, the St. Louis Blues owner, Bill Laurie, and he had full intention of moving the team to St. Louis. And I was heartbroken. And to this day, it was still the hardest emotional phase I've ever been through. It was like getting divorced like 7 times at once. It was so tough. And ultimately, of course, David Sturm stepped in. He said, "No way, this market needs more of an opportunity." And then ultimately, they were swindled anyways, and they got moved to Memphis. And obviously, I think that was a big mistake because Vancouver has just exploded in size and wealth and population since then. And
Yeah.
Memphis, and I have nothing against the people of Memphis. I'm happy they're doing well. I'm happy the team's exciting. And for the first time, I'm actually interested and and kind of cheering for that team. But in 2001, I switched allegiances to the Toronto Raptors, and I suffered for the better part of 13 years with that team. And of course, I absolutely relished the 2019 championship. I was actually at game 5 of the finals in Toronto, and Kyle Lowry missed a 3-pointer at the buzzer that would have won the title. So I missed out on seeing an NBA championship in person, but it was still great to be part of the NBA finals. And then, of course, I follow some other teams as well. So I'm a big fan of Japanese baseball. I've been a big Ham Fighters fan ever since they played in Tokyo before they moved to Hokkaido, and a bunch of other stuff as well. So, yeah, sports, sports, sports.
I know it's everything else sorts of gets in the way, doesn't it? But the one thing I could never actually figure out is after the Grizzlies leave, did they take Bryant Big Country Reeves with them, or did
Oh
is he
man.
still around somewhere? There was a
Oh,
documentary came out about what Big Country did after his career in the NBA, and I never actually did check it out.
don't
But
waste your time. He lives on a farm and he look that's all you need to know is he's happy on a farm somewhere. And it's so funny, right? Like you could write an entire paper, a study, a textbook on how badly managed that team was. Every single decision, like, and it's not even like, hey, 25 years later, we look back, that was a bad decision. They were all bad decisions at the time. Like you were going to draft. So it was one thing to draft Bryant Reeves, right? Like that. He's your first pick in the first round in 95. He's the guy you're going to sign, build your entire organization around. It's a mistake. Everyone knows it's a mistake. But then in the summer of 98, you sign him to a $60 million extension. And people talk about the fact that, well, it was the Kevin Garnett, the $100 million plus Kevin Garnett extension that led to the labor disruption. No, it was the Bryant Reeves signing for $60 million. But anyways, I digress. We shouldn't be talking so much
well,
about Bryant
before
Reeves.
I want to talk about one more thing about, and we'll wrap it up on a Formula One note, which we should
Sure.
do. But just going back to the Grizzlies, everything you need to know about them and where the missteps were, go back to then general manager Stu Jackson, because I remember him relating to one story about like in the early '70s or whatever it was, somebody had approached him about investing a small sum of money, although 5 grand probably wasn't a small amount in the early '70s, but anyways, he had the opportunity to invest 5 grand into Nike way back in the day, and he turned it down because he thought that the company would never take off. So there you go. Anyways, moving back to Formula One, and we're going to close it off because we don't have a race this weekend. We've got a week off until we go to Paul Ricard. And it's interesting too because Mercedes says that they believe what they call a really promising theory about some of the struggles that they've had with the W12, and it has to do with the difficulties that they've had uh, warming up the front tires on the car. And I find it really interesting because we're 6 races into the season, and obviously that this car is not as good as they thought it was going to be, because I remember, excuse me, going back a year ago, they were saying that the W11, the 2020 car, was the best car that they'd ever built, and this car is just a development of that car. I mean, it's basically all a development of the 2019 car, but I mean, the changes to the cars this year are subtle, and this car is not really lived up to the hype. And we've seen some of the issues that they've had so far this year, and I just find it really fascinating that after 6 races, they just now have a promising theory. They don't have an answer, but they have a promising theory that it's all related to the issues that they're having to warming up the front tires. What do you think about that, Mark? Is that as surprising to you as it is to me, or no?
I don't know, man. It's funny. It kind of ties in with one of the questions. So somebody had actually just asked us on the live stream as well. Tasimba, specifically asked, "Do you think Mercedes will return? The Mercedes that we know and love, will that team return at Paul Ricard?" I'm not super confident. I feel like the team as a marketing exercise has to project some sense of confidence, but I
Hmm.
think it hasn't just been one thing that's derailed this team, right? Like if they'd been able to finish every single race and they were simply off the pace, or their times in certain sectors were consistently low, or they were having traction issues in certain corners, and then like, aha, here's that one thing. But it just seems to be so many different things. It's driver error, it's driver execution, it's pit execution. I don't know that one single thing is going to solve this huge variety of very different issues that they've been encountering. So it's good that they're projecting some positivity outwards, but I think Paul Ricard will be telling. And we were talking about this yesterday when we were doing our live chat, but historically, with the exception of a couple of podiums that Ferrari scored, Mercedes has owned that event. They've owned that event since Paul Ricard was back on the calendar. I'm not particularly confident that they're going to win or they're going to score a pole here, simply because, and I want to be careful because I've been criticized, justifiably so, for sounding a little bit too pro Red Bull, but Red Bull just seems to be dialed in a way that Mercedes isn't.
Hmm.
And the sense I get, and we don't know this, is that all things being equal from an aero perspective and a driver perspective, every piece of data and every piece of telemetry is telling us that that Red Bull is a faster car. So if they're equal in the corner and the arrow is equal and the driver is equal, that Red Bull is just a faster car. And this is a track that works really well for powerful cars. It's got long, fast, sweeping corners, and I feel like the Red Bull cars are going to be successful there.
Yeah, that's why I think it was really so striking to me the last weekend. We talked about it in the post race show on Sunday night that it really looked like it was a role reversal. You had Max out
Yeah.
there leading the race, then you had Sergio in second. Sort of that buffer between Max and Lewis, and then Lewis in that position, he was close but not quite close enough to make a move on Perez. He had a couple of opportunities, and it really looked like they'd switched places because Lewis was in that spot where Max has been for the past year or two, and then Sergio is the place where Bottas usually is. And then Lewis was trying to do the things that Max would usually be doing to try and get around Bottas to try and make a run at the lead, and it was just it really stuck out more that last race than maybe some of the other races this evening or this season. But I mean, they've been fairly it's been fairly even, right? I mean, they were all pretty even when we went sorry, not Baku, but Bahrain, and then Imola was, I guess, maybe a little bit more advantage Red Bull, and then it kind of seesawed back and forth in Portugal and then Spain, but to give a slight edge maybe to Mercedes, those two tracks kind of suited them more, and then yeah, it's just but I just don't have a lot of confidence in Mercedes. And the big question is, of course, that if there are issues with the car, how much are they going to be invested into spending the time, into the money, into upgrading the car, knowing that the slate is going to be completely wiped clean. The Etch a Sketch is going to be shaken up and be brand new for 2022 with these new cars. At some point, they're just going to say, it is what it is. And maybe this is the one that, yeah, although it sucks that we're not going to win the championship, or maybe we win one and not the other, but maybe this is the one that we maybe concede and really focus on 2022 and getting back on winning and dominating like we've done for so many years.
And maybe there's something to that. And I don't think they throw in the white towel anytime soon, but maybe that point in the season comes because I think heading into this year, Hamilton's future with this team seemed pretty uncertain. And
Yeah.
we know he wasn't happy with the term of the deal. We know he wasn't happy with the very substantial pay cut he took coming into this season, especially when the value of the team is skyrocketing and Total Wolf is simply he's cashed it in, man. Like he's making so much money off of this team. Like I think Lewis has every reason to be unhappy with the size of that contract because Toto
Yeah.
is not sacrificing anything, man, and justifiably so. Like he helped build this organization, but I think that there's confidence now that Hamilton will be back in 2022 and possibly 2023. Like if he has another 2 years in him, if this year looks like it's going to be a romp for Red Bull, at what point do you just reposition your resources and go all in on 2022, 2023? Again, 2022 and 2023, the risk is that it's going to be incredibly unpredictable and nobody would know what it's going to look like with the new
Yep.
regs. And there's no guarantee that you're going to show up with a front running kind of car that's going to score podiums every single weekend. One other comment, real quick, because
Sure.
I know you're eager to move on. Michael Prince on the live stream says, "You guys look nothing like I expected you guys to look like." I don't know what that means or how to take it. Hopefully, it's a compliment.
I hope so. If we show up next week wearing paper bags, you'll know what our self-conscious sides picked up on or took over on that one. But
Totally.
yeah, I mean, it was just it's one of those things, right? I mean, we were forced to do the show remotely because of the whole pandemic and the social distancing and just wanting to do the responsible thing. But it really does kind of leave us with some choices to make here now that things are starting to go back to normal. It's just we started recording the video just because hey, we were video conferencing anyways, and at some point we're going to have to make a call. It's just like, are we going to want to start putting some serious effort into improving our YouTube presence? But unfortunately, the looks are the way that they are. So we can maybe improve the production and maybe improve the type of content. But looks, I'm afraid you guys are stuck with what you got. So
Cool.
for better
Before,
or worse.
before we sign off, and I keep
Okay.
saying this, we need just 16 more followers to hit 2,000 on Twitter. And I'm not the one to beg or ask, but I would love if we were able to hit 2,000 so we could celebrate that on this upcoming Monday show. And the reason that I'm so proud of that follower count is simply because I scroll through it. These aren't eggs, these aren't bots, these are legit F1 fans that
Yeah.
are here to talk about F1 and be part of the community and be part of the team, and I love it. But I would be so excited if we were able to hit 2,000 followers for the next pod.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thanks for all the engagement and the follows and the downloads and the views and everything. And for especially those of you brave enough to sit through the live stream while we do this, it is really cool to be able to interact with you guys, real time. It's a lot of fun, and that's the whole point that we do the show, is to sit down, talk Formula One, and talk about it with you guys. And we love getting all the questions and the comments, and we'll do so again next time. And well, we could go on, but in the interest of people have other things to do with their lives, we're going to cut it off here. And because we don't have the race this weekend, you don't have to wait a full week until we come back with another show. So we'll come back on Monday night. And until then, on behalf of myself and my friend and co-host Mark Hamilton, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thanks for the tweets and the emails. If you want to get in touch, by all means, do so on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod, or via email, that is, at scuderiaf1pod at gmail.com. And that's it. That's a wrap. Have a great weekend, guys. Take care, and we'll talk to you again very, very soon. Bye for now.